Hi, everyone.
Covering worker stories and struggles throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. But honestly, it would be great if we could kind of open it up and make it sort of like an interactive thing. So if you got questions or thoughts you want to share, please, yeah, don't be shy. So I guess without further ado, let me read just a little bit from the introduction to this book, The Work of Living, which is now published by Or Books. And if y'all haven't seen it already, cover is designed by the amazing Molly Crabapple. I had no idea what I wanted this book to be. I just knew that it had to be. The COVID 19 pandemic, compounded by our government's truly villainous failure to respond adequately to it, has taken so much and so many from us. As working people, most of whom had no choice, risked and lost their lives keeping the gears of commerce and society turning, as many others pickled in the lonesome brine of their own homes, as time melted into a dull, endless horror, and as the horror itself became commonplace, it became clear that regardless of what comes next, we need to keep a human record of this long moment. We need to remember how this feels. In the future, We'll need to remember how we felt about this as it was actually happening to us, because those who aim to capitalize on it will tell us to remember it differently, or they'll have us recall only very select parts of the experience. The question for us, then, one of the most deeply political questions of all, is what will we remember and how will we remember it? When the strange experience of enduring the first COVID-19 pandemic coagulates into history, whose voices will go on the record? Who will tell the story of what happened here? How will they tell that story? What will they focus on? And what will we care to listen to? More importantly, how will we each see ourselves as participants in and shapers of this history? Will we forget all the things that mattered to us at the time, all the ways we experienced and felt about what was happening to us? Will we wash out all the raw human stuff, the kind of stuff you'll find in this book, and leave only a clean, bloodless record of key dates and figures? Or will we carry with us the memory of something more? And will we use that memory to do good and do better? In case it wasn't obvious by now, I put this book together in the hopes of offering a partial answer to these questions. The people and stories in this book are the kind of people and stories I think should be shaping our collective historical narrative of COVID-19. In fact, for the same reason I think it's bad and wrong to simplify, judge, and categorize people we know little about, I think we should all be deeply suspicious of any retelling of human history that leaves little room for or deliberately excludes the messy, complex lives of the working people who lived and made it. To see and appreciate that messiness, I believe, is the only way we can begin to understand history and each other. History is messy because it is human, and humanity is messy. The practice of history, I mean. I'm not just talking about the past as such. I'm talking about the stories we tell, the records we keep, and the memories we carry with us that serve as the collective lineage of our species. When we lose the beautiful human messiness of history, it becomes something else entirely, something that is not really ours. A half-true story we're told to tell about a dead past where the significant parts have already been colored in for us. This book aims to tell the history of this moment in a different way. Perhaps you could see it as a handful of working people, as if pushing their hands into wet concrete, pressing the imprint of their lives, thoughts, and experiences onto history before it hardens, because they believe, as I do, that these stories are worth telling, sharing, preserving, and listening to with care. So if you want to read the rest of it, you can go buy a copy. Thank you. So, I mean, it's very bizarre to be sitting here, right? Because I feel like one of the effects of COVID-19 that we can all appreciate is that time, like I said in the intro, kind of melted into this permanent present, and my sense of time is just completely messed up. And so things that feel like they were just a week ago were actually 2-3 years ago. Things that were 2-3 years ago feel like they were 50 years ago. And so it's been messing with my head to sort of reflect on where I was when I recorded these interviews for this book, and where we were as a society when COVID-19 really set in. And so I wanted to sort of like start there, because to prepare for this, I went back and I went through all the bylines that Alex, Luis, and I have over the past 2.5 years. And it kind of serves as this sort of time capsule, right? A time capsule of some pretty horrendous times. But I think there's so much important stuff that Luis and Alex have preserved in their reporting on worker struggles and tenants' rights struggles, right? Immigrant rights struggles. I mean, like, we all kept doing our work, but it wasn't easy, right? And in fact, Alex, if folks didn't read it, there was a really beautiful piece that Alex wrote for Jacobin right at the beginning of the pandemic, called something to the effect of "You Can't Go Back Home." And I think it was a very personal piece, more personal than other pieces I've read by you. And you know, you were narrating what it was like to be in New York City when COVID hit, and I can't imagine what it was like for you two kind of being here during all of that. But in that moment, you wrote, you know, that it felt like there was an emptiness in writing, right? And you were struggling and kind of working through what the point of this work was at a moment of mass death and confusion and fear. I was wondering if we could kind of all like sort of start there and reflect on like what how we kind of managed to keep doing that work amidst the onset of COVID-19. If Luis, you felt the same way about writing at that moment and how you dealt with that or got over it. So I guess Alex, why don't we, since you wrote the piece, why don't we start with you?
Sure. So first of all, I just want to say I didn't notice till we are sitting here. I almost wore this shirt too, so I'm very glad I didn't. The Railroad Workers United shirt.
Shout out.
Given that that fight's not over, good choice. Yeah. So when Max mentioned this piece right before this event started, I went back and looked at it, and I mean, first it's published on April 1st of 2020. So really the very beginning of the pandemic, and it opens with my father says 2 weeks. Now, my father is a respiratory therapist at the biggest hospital in Pittsburgh, and 2 weeks was when they'd been told that the system was going to be overwhelmed with COVID patients. So he was just waiting, and he quickly makes a joke. You know, I had a gunshot patient today, not COVID. You know, laugh. He's so glad it's not gotten bad yet. And then it was just shocking to even read that sentence, because seeing what my father personally has gone through over the past 2.5 years in this job, where respiratory therapists are the ones dealing with ventilators, you know, they really have been the central healthcare worker, kind of overwhelmed by COVID. Yeah, I mean, I think that piece was written out of a place where you're hearing sirens constantly around you in New York City. Things are really, you know, going to shit in a really dramatic way. People are very quickly spiraling into bad places. And it felt something that I often feel to more or less degrees in different times of what's the point of writing in a state in this country where like the working class is so disorganized, so disarticulated, things are so bad, and it feels like the obstacles are the structures up against any kind of reforms, much less anything more radical than that, are so immense, right? And so you think, what am I really doing here? And I think I'm glad you wanted to start this way, because I think your book is one answer to that, which is, you know, reading your intro myself brought to mind something that's a famous quote by the British historian, labor historian E.P. Thompson, who in the intro to the making of the English working class wrote that he was trying to rescue the working class from the enormous condescension of posterity, right? This sense that, you know, as time goes on, people are going to slot people into categories and things that take the life out of what really was happening at the time. And I think there's value to that in itself. There are other values to writing, you know, political interventions we want to make and so on. But there is, especially in a time of enormous social crisis, I think a real value to a book like this, and to the reporting that you've done otherwise and that Luis has done, myself, in sort of, you know, I don't want to say something as corny as like the first draft of history, but there's some truth to, you know, you're getting people's words down, their actual experiences, and it can't be taken away. They said it, it's on the page. This is what it was like in this moment. And you know that people are going to try to systematize how people felt or categorize how people felt in ways that are simplifying. But at the end of the day, this will be a problem, right? The messiness exists, it was there. And so, you know, I think that was part of what kept me going, is that I'm very engaged with the working class movement, the labor movement. You know, this is not only my work, but my political community, my own family, all of these things. And so I think it sort of in a way just raised the stakes of what it meant to really try to help people kind of like tip the scale in certain workplace fights and whatnot. And so it really, I think that piece was a natural moment of like, what would it look like to really be in despair and then move forward, get it on the page, say this is how it felt, and then go back to what you need to do. So that's sort of how I made sense of continuing to work for the past 2.5 years.
Well, and I was going to say, I was like, clearly you figured it out, right? Because I was scrolling through page after page of pieces that you wrote. And that like was the same for you, Luis. And in fact, it felt like in a lot of ways, your writing took off right around when COVID hit. So I imagine we all at some point felt this sense of urgency that writing inevitably, writing or podcasting or what have you, like became an outlet for. Like, am I off base there?
No, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, I had started out as an intern at the Nation in 2013 and had tried to make it as a journalist, and it didn't quite pan out. So I did comms work for unions and other nonprofit work. So during the pandemic, I was working in city government and was really frustrated. And after work, rather than like shut down, I felt like the way that I wanted to cope with the crisis was by throwing myself into something like wholeheartedly. And there was this compulsion that I felt to write. And after work or late in the day, I would go out to Corona Plaza in Queens, where I grew up, and I would talk to street vendors. And a lot of them had been working in the city, they lost their jobs, and they had turned to vending to make ends meet. So I kind of felt like that was a moment. Like I have said to friends of mine, I'm like, everyone became a journalist, a labor journalist during the pandemic, and I include myself in that too, because that's when I really started like getting back into the writing, because it's been, I mean, it is hard to do this work. And during the pandemic, it was I mean, eventually I got to a point where I was like, oh my God, I wrote like 60 articles last year. I'm like, that output, I can't sustain it anymore. Like, what I now have to grapple with all the loss that happened during the pandemic. But at the moment, it was kind of like a balm for the pain that I was feeling, and just the frustration, like having worked in government. Like around that time, like I was seeing stories of bodies buried in or being transported in U-Hauls, and like reading the opening interview with Nick Galupo, who was digging graves around that time, or I mean, that's what he was doing as a living. Kind of hit home, just like in terms of like what's like all that invisible labor that goes into making like our society run. Like even thinking about like our service economy and how reliant it is on these temporary servants, right? Through like DoorDash, like Uber, all these things. It's like kind of like an extension of this, like I wouldn't say feudal setup, but like temporary servants. Like we've become overly reliant on these services. Like I know Barbara Einreich recently like passed away, and I remember when I first read like Nickel and Dime, one of the things that really struck me was a passage where she was talking about how she never had domestic like workers clean, um, like her house, clean her shit, clean after. Like she just saw something like that as such an indignity to have that. Of course, there are people that for health reasons they need that support, and that's different. But I think it's become normalized, like how much we rely on like temporary servants, right? So I wanted to capture those stories, and talk about how people were fighting back, how they were trying to make not just ends meet, but how they were trying to transform their workplaces, how they were exerting their agency. Because when the pandemic struck, there's always this impulse, especially as journalists, to cover the horrors, to talk about like, look how people are suffering, and to kind of pull at those moral heartstrings to get some policy change. But the movement that I'm committed is one that believes in the transformative power of working people to rule society. So wherever there is evidence of that, of people becoming fit to rule through taking action at their workplaces, that's something that we want to hold up a mirror to and say, you too can do that.
Right. I mean, like, and funnily enough, like, this is something I was talking to the great artist Terry Tapp about, who's sitting right there, last night while he was tattooing my shit. Like, but we were talking about this too, like what does a working class literature look like? And it feels like we're so culturally stunted before even proffering an answer to that question that it's like the only thing we can answer is like, I don't know, a workplace story or a strike story. Like we have this sort of cultural funneling effect where we can only really define working people by the jobs that they do, and that kind of class position. But there's so much more, you know, about our lives and about our own existential struggles for meaning and purpose and happiness and togetherness that, you know, is genuinely beautiful. And I think it's that stuff, that's the raw human stuff I refer to in the introduction of this book, that I find so important to preserve in the interviews that I do, which is why the interviews that I do are always 2 or 3 hours long. And if I had my way, they would be twice as long. And in fact, if you go back to the first season of my show, Working People, the interviews were like 3 hours. But I realized that's a lot to ask of interviewees and of listeners, so I kind of came to a happy compromise. But yeah, like that was like kind of the peculiar sort of quandary that we were in during COVID-19, right? I use the past tense that we're still in, right? Where COVID was unique in the sense that it finally forced this system to admit that it needs us, right? After spending so many years, I mean, basically our entire lifetimes, every job that I've had up until COVID, like essentially came with the implied or explicit message that I was replaceable, that I was expendable, that I, as an individual, did not matter, right? I mattered as much as my body could perform the labor that was necessary for the job that I was hired to do. And I feel like COVID simultaneously made that dehumanizing effect manifest in the most gruesome ways. Like you said, like to the point that bodies were being stacked in U-Hauls. And you look and you think like this was a person with a life and a backstory and so much experience that is now just being warehoused like a bag of meat. Like, you know, there's something so incredibly wrong about that. And what I felt was the more that we allowed ourselves to accept that level of mass death, that level of erasure of the preciousness of every human life, the more that we were conditioning ourselves to accept more mass death. And I think that looking down the barrel of a pretty horrifying century, we need to fight against that as much as humanly possible. But at the same time, right, when again, from the government, from private industry, when that word essential came forward, like, I don't know about you guys, but like everyone I've talked to, like, they don't forget that. Like that lodges in your brain when you're like finally told that, oh no, you are essential. And you're being told that from your shithead boss who's like holed away in their third home, right? Saying, oh no, we need you to keep things moving. Otherwise society is going to collapse. So I wanted to ask, like, in that first year, whether you were talking to street vendors, respiratory, you know, therapists, but I mean, like, again, I went through our bylines and I saw so many different folks that we talked to. I guess, what were you hearing, or what was really striking you with how frontline, essential, whatever we want to call them, workers were dealing with this?
Yeah, I mean, so before this event, Max asked us a couple things. You know, are there certain dynamics that have played out over the past couple of years that strike you as really important, or kind of bad developments? And I mean, one on the sort of positive, I don't know whether I would really call this positive. One important one, of course, was that this kind of clarified the stakes for people, right? I mean, I'm really loath to generalize the working class. I agree with Max and Luis on this one, that everybody's going to have this. I think this is the value of this book. One of the values is everyone's so unique. But there was certainly a lot of people who had this experience of going to work each day, risking their health and that of their families, that kind of clarified the stakes of like, oh, I am the working class and you are the owning class. There was this sort of resentment against management, against owners and CEOs, and of course, against anybody else who didn't have to risk their health. There was this sort of sense of, you know, one, I have nothing left to lose now. You know, this person is willing to kill me to keep his company, you know, profitable. And if that's the case, then that kind of clarifies things for me, right? You know, I don't need to tiptoe around the dynamics. There's a conflict here. It's a class conflict. One of us has to be willing to risk death or infecting our families, one doesn't. And I think that generated a lot of kind of the new organizing or energy that I'm sure we'll talk about during the pandemic was this kind of like the obfuscation that we talked about, that you mentioned earlier, of like, that there's, you know, there's no class in America. Everybody can move on up. It's, you know, things were clarified in a really horrifying way, I think, for a lot of people. So that's one dynamic, I think, that I saw a lot. And the word essential, of course, came up all the time. And it's funny, you know, Max mentioned this piece I wrote at the beginning of April. And I also looked at, you know, I wrote something for the Washington Post in mid-April that was, you know, Amazon says warehouse workers are essential. It better treat them like it, you know, and it was a sort of, I hope, you know, if Amazon doesn't provide the PPE, if they don't protect workers from COVID, which there's clear evidence if you talk to the workers that they're not actually providing the kind of protective gear that they're saying they're providing, I think that people are going to have the stakes of their relationship to Amazon clarified. And sure enough, that has started to happen. You know, this was before the kind of union campaigns really got going at Amazon. And so I think there's very clear industries for sure where you can kind of look at those dynamics and say that at a certain point, the rhetoric just kind of became so hypocritical that it kind of moved people at least into conversations that they hadn't been in. And then 3 years down the road, almost now, you know, that has in fact come to the fore in new union campaigns and whatnot.
Yeah, no, I mean, I totally agree with that. I think it kind of crystallized for people that labor produces all value. so, so yeah, I mean,
I'm glad everyone agrees with that now. Cool.
But I think there were also like obviously contradictions, right? Because of like, even if you have that moment of clarity and you realize that, yeah, like, you know, my boss wants me dead, like, or my boss doesn't care if I die, like the compulsions of the system are still going to coerce you into working, right? And one of the things that I found, like, I remember I went to New Brunswick, New Jersey to talk to workers outside of a Access Bio plant. They're part of like a global supply chain where they produce like test kits for malaria, for dengue fever, for the World Health Organization, for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, for Doctors Without Borders. And here were these immigrant workers, all of them temp workers, by the way, who had been at the company for like 10 years, protesting, demanding that they be given days off so they could quarantine because they had an exposure. And they had been fighting this company for many years. And one of the way that the workers got to this plant was that they got in these 15 passenger vans from like Plainfield, New Jersey to New Brunswick. And the woman that was driving the van, Karen, I remember her telling me, either we die of COVID or we die of hunger. Like I remember her just flat out like saying that to me. And then like, you know, she had like her whole van, like she had exposures in the van transporting workers back and forth. Because if you all, like in city government at the time, there was a lot of talk about like, you know, we have outsourced industrial or offshored industrial production. We need to bring it back home, right? So there was a lot of money. And here's this plant, it's in New Jersey. They're manufacturing COVID test kits. So they got a windfall of money to produce these test kits to just ramp up production. And their workforce, all of them were, you know, like basically treated like garbage. And like, the workers would when workers started grumbling, they'd say that the managers would just tap them in the shoulder and tell them like to leave, you know, like if they were coughing or something were happening, like there were no guidelines basically. So I think that in terms of what crystallized for people and how the pandemic, it's been like unevenly felt. And even to today, right? Like I also went to Georgia during the pandemic to report on a chemical leak at a poultry plant. And as you all remember, the poultry facilities, the Trump administration kept them running all throughout the pandemic. And in this particular poultry plant, all the workers were undocumented. And when I was there reporting on the story, like it was the official news had like names for them like basically the fake names that they had given the administration. And then I'm like, okay, but this person died. They're like, oh no, that was not there. So they had lived in this community for like 20, 30 years, worked at this facility, and it just kind of threw together all those contradictions in terms of immigration, how reliant this plant was on, in particular, undocumented immigrants to work at these poultry plants, and just like how, like what kind of existence they had, where even in their death, like you still couldn't quite like piece together, like, okay, who were they? You know, like it was, and it was by design, obviously, that was the case. Like the plant knew, you know, they would they enforced this by design to just control them and, you know, prevent them from organizing. And around that same time, you know, there was the Amazon organizers started in Bessemer, which is about like an hour away. The union that was trying to do that work represents poultry workers. So to me, all these contradictions were kind of like in the air. And I feel like one of the, not positive, but one of the developments that happened while all these horrible things are happening is that the government, despite like the shortcomings, they did things that no one said they could do in terms of the relief and the stimulus, right? So we had been given a diet of austerity for years, and then all of a sudden the government could provide funding for people to stay home 2 weeks if they were exposed to COVID. And then the fight was to expand that. But all of a sudden, like that opened up a horizon for workers to demand more. And that kind of leads to what Alex pointed to in terms of the new organizing, where workers said like, okay, my boss wants me dead or doesn't care if I die, and the government can do all these things. Hey, I can demand more from my job. Like I have leverage. There's a worker shortage right now because workers are leaving jobs to get better ones, because they can command higher wages. So I think that opening is going to close soon, and it's going to have ramifications for the Teamsters in terms of their contract negotiations if inflation, you know, skyrockets or if they discipline workers to bring inflation down. But yeah, I mean, I think there was both like these contradictions and these openings, which every historical moment has some of those, right? The openings and the contradictions. So we're still grappling with that.
Yeah, I just want to name two more dynamics, and then just as things that I think are worth thinking about, that maybe haven't gotten at least enough. I haven't seen enough discussion of this stuff, I think. So on the one hand, another interesting development, sort of as far as political horizons of workplace struggles, you know, moving beyond just the workplace into like what would a broader kind of class-wide demand look like. One thing that was very obvious to me that I certainly didn't predict necessarily before the pandemic happened was that struggles, I mean, there were struggles over PPE and over wages, of course, but struggles over time really came to the forefront in a way that I found just everywhere I looked, everyone I spoke to, every strike I saw, this was one of the core demands. So one, that means both against mandatory overtime. You know, a lot of workplaces, especially where workers were already unionized, the bosses, instead of trying to find new workers and they felt that they, you know, were having trouble finding new workers, they would just take their existing workers and force overtime on them. So we saw all these, you know, especially in the food manufacturing sector, but this was an issue at John Deere. This was an issue in IATSE, the film and TV production workers. They wanted fewer hours. They didn't want to have to work these unbelievable shifts. You know, people talking about, I worked 80 hours this week and every week for several weeks. And then the flip side of that, of course, is people who don't get enough hours or who don't have any control over their scheduling. You know, we think about retail and fast food as kind of the classic, where you're told 12 hours before your shift what your schedule is going to be, or that you have to be back at the cafe 10 hours after you closed it. And those are very related fights, right? Even though there's often pitted against each other, you know, workers who just want to work overtime and get a ton of money versus people who have very precarious, low wage jobs. But to me, that was a very clear kind of demand that is not just a bread and butter question of wages or benefits, but in fact, a sense of we deserve the right to some say over how this workplace operates, and also connects people across industries, across fragments of the class, right? I mean, we saw these struggles among white collar workers and among the most traditional blue collar manufacturing workers. And something that I think hasn't gotten enough thought in the years since. I mean, the US labor movement was built on the fight for the 8-hour day, something that united all kinds of people. And their, labor leaders in the 1940s and 50s really tamped down on the demand for fewer hours with the same pay. And I think maybe conditions are sort of forcing those questions right now in a way that I find sort of worth thinking harder about when we think about like what could come out of this shared social experience. And then I won't talk too long. I'll just say that I think the one concerning thing when Luis talked about sort of temporary servants earlier, one concern, of course, is that there was this disarticulation, right? There were the workers who could stay home and the workers who had to serve them. And my concern is that those kind of divisions, which already exist for a variety of reasons, maybe white collar workers have better pay, they have, they're sort of might have social distinctions, higher education than the people who are serving them. Those kind of got reified in a way that, there's this real, almost like you can see hostility at times, in a sense that I actually don't have that much in common with the person on the other side of that divide, or resentment if you're on the side that has to serve the one that doesn't. And that, I think that's going to be like a lasting problem and something that certainly works against my political project. I think the political project of both of you as well is this sense that divisions within the working class got hardened in certain ways. And you see that play out in other fights too, like homelessness in New York City. There's a cruelty that has crept in, I think, a sense of, I just need to protect myself. And you see that kind of get weaponized by people like Eric Adams or people who, run the businesses around this neighborhood. Anyway, okay, I'll stop talking.
No, I mean, I think that's all spot on. And, just to kind of underline the point about time, I noticed the same thing. I think we all probably came to that revelation at some point over the past year or two. And, I've been doing these like around monthly like segments for Breaking Points. The first one I did was on the struggle for time because I was like, it feels like this keeps coming up and no one's talking about it. So I mentioned like the Warrior Met coal strikers, right? They're currently the longest running strike in the United States. They've been on 1,100 coal miners in Deep Red, Alabama have been on strike since April 1st of 2021. And this is their main complaint. We want to see our families, right? Like we are essentially sacrificing any semblance of a life to give life to our children, right? This is a struggle working class and poor people know, sadly, all too well. But I think it is important that you're hearing echoes of that same complaint in so many different types of workplaces. And I'll connect that back to like stuff that I've heard from a number of different folks that I interviewed for this book. But just to kind of really drive that point home, I'm wearing Railroad Workers United shirt. I'm sure all of you have been hearing about the crisis on the nation's railroad system. That crisis has been brewing for a long time. I think that's another thing I want to emphasize is that it comes through in all of our reporting and the interviews for this book that there can be a compulsion to sort of think like COVID dropped like a bomb and changed our world, right? So what did COVID do to, like galvanize all this like labor organizing or this rethinking of labor? And I think it's a little more nuanced than that because a lot of the folks who were going on strike last year, people who've been working at those jobs for years, if not decades, right? And these pressures had been mounting. And I think COVID really accelerated them and boiled things over. And that's very much the case with the railroads, right? Because COVID gets you sick. The railroads have been slashing and burning their workforce. They used to have over 500,000 people working on the Class 1 freight railroads in 1980. Since then, they've slashed that to under 130,000. Since 2015 alone, the Class 1 freight rail carriers have eliminated over 30% of their workforce, and now they're complaining about a labor shortage, right? Or they're complaining that they don't have enough people. And every railroader that we've talked to has said like, well, yeah, like you fired them all and you've run all the rest of them into the ground, right? But like they say the same thing. We have no set schedule. We have no ability to plan our lives. Like we can't make dates with our spouses, right? We can't go to our kids' t-ball games, right? That side of our life, the side that gives meaning to our lives and to the work that we do is gone. And human beings, I think one of the commonalities that we're seeing is that human beings will reject that after a certain point. And in fact, we just published a piece at the Real News Today by the great Jacob Morrison down in Alabama about workers at a paper mill who were about to go on strike. They just rejected a tentative agreement with a $28,000 signing bonus because they said, like, the company wants to get rid of the provisions in the contract that include steep penalties for making them work a lot of overtime, right? And essentially it's blood money. It's like, you know, like, we will pay you $28,000 to sign this thing, and you will lose any semblance of a weekend, of a life. Just sign it, right? And it's pretty incredible and heroic that these workers said, fuck that, right? And so they're going to be locked out unless a tentative agreement is reached in the next 48 hours. I think about something that Sherry Renfro, a worker at the Frito-Lay plant in Topeka, Kansas, told me. And I connected with Sherry through Dan DiMaggio at Labor Notes because they were reporting on this when the strike happened. And that's another thing I want to emphasize here too, right, is that there's a lot of camaraderie that really, like, gives me hope, not just among the three of us, but our, like, labor reporting community. Like, there will be, like, sometimes Luis will write a great piece and he'll say, hey, I talked to this person, like, you need to interview them. Like, they got a lot more to say, right? And I've, like, passed stuff on to Alex. I was like, you'd be the perfect person to write on this if you could. So I think that that's really valuable. I just wanted to mention that. But Sherry Renfro told me something when they were going on strike that really stuck with me. She said, you know, when they hire new people at Frito-Lay, they walk them through the plant, they show them, you know, like, what they're going to be doing. They explain all the machinery, and they try to, like, tout the amenities that workers get there, right? And she overheard the managers talking to a new batch of workers saying, like, oh, here's a visitation room. So, like, your family can come and, like, you can see them for like 15 minutes on your break and then go back to work. And Sherry's telling me, she's like, you know, at first I thought, oh, that sounds nice. But then she was like, where else have I heard that term? Yeah. But she's like, prison. Prisons have visitation rooms. She's like, how fucked is it that it's presented as a benefit that the one time I get to see my kids awake is if they come to this plant and see me in a dingy windowless room for 15 minutes. Like, that is what we're talking about. And so I guess with the time remaining, so I want us to open up for Q&A in a second, but, like, let's talk about how we're seeing this manifest in workers pushing back, the organizing that's happening, the strikes that are happening, and yeah, sadly, as Luis rightly pointed out, right, the kind of reaction that we're currently seeing right now, right? I think we're all aware of it. The Fed is going to war with the working class. Companies that have been raking in record profits are trying to take more and more, even though workers sacrifice so much to keep their goddamn companies afloat and make them those record profits. There is a real class struggle happening right now. Affordable housing is going away. Like, I mean, like, I don't want to sound like an acceleration, but, like, it feels like the dialectic is very hot right now, right? I mean, like, shit is dialecticking right now. So I guess, like, I imagine we've all been asked this question a million times over the past 2.5 years. Why, like, you know, why are workers organizing? Like, is this a strike wave, a new labor movement? I guess, what would you say to the folks here, you know, about what reporting on labor struggles over the COVID-19 pandemic has taught you about where this energy is coming from and where it might go? Anyone take it?
I'm really circumspect on that question. I mean, I agree with what Alex said about, like, the dangers of like, dividing the working class. Like, one of the moments that I remember during the pandemic that was, like, gave me hope was when folks would, like, take out their pots and start banging, like, to support like, anytime an ambulance passed by. So there were these moments of people coming together. There were also folks doing eviction defense work. And anytime you bring people together, you know, like, you're kind of in creating collective spaces for people to come together, it kind of acts as a bulwark against like the rugged individualism that this system is designed to jam down our throats, right? So right now what we are seeing is like efforts to segment like the working class and talk about like how this group of workers doesn't deserve this, or how, so this has been going on for some time, but I feel like it's been exacerbated now. Like there's a wave of reaction is, I guess, what I'm trying to get at, and that's in the political sphere, right? So we don't know what will happen in the election results in Brazil, but we know what happened in Italy, and Trumpism is still very much alive here in the U.S. So I think that this is a scary time for the left, because despite all the great news about workers establishing new independent unions, there's still a long road to go, to winning a first contract. The media will turn away from these stories if there are more losses, right? Like this will be like a moment. Like I remember when the John Deere strike happened and my colleague Jonah was covering that, in ABC News was like, all of a sudden, Terry Morin was like Comrade Terry for like a hot minute, right?
Dark Terry.
So those moments are really ephemeral. So I am really, that's why institutions are so valuable. That's why, like, I'm a member. Mike died on me, or is it okay? I'm a member of DSA, and I think. It's the best organization right now on the left in order to create and foster mass organizations, to create tenant unions, to support independent efforts to establish new unions or to organize new workplaces, because we need to build up our collective ranks in order to take on the battles that are ahead of us. So I am really circumspect about like where the strike wave or the uptick in worker militancy is, because a lot of that, the wings of that could be cut like pretty quickly. And yeah, because this is very tenuous, like what we have right now. It's what I'm trying to get at. So I'm hopeful, but yeah.
I think I'll save my answer for later. Just I want to, if there's anybody with questions, let's, for the sake of time. I think we can all hear you if you, oh, there is a mic. Okay. Cool. Oh, right, the online people. Does anyone have questions?
Or thoughts on that?
This is my name's Teddy. Hello. I'm curious to ask Max about the book, specifically, I guess, working in two mediums, right? You recorded these interviews, transcribed them, and there is a lot of work that goes into that. And I guess talking about shaping those interviews, but also the difference between what you normally do, or not normally, but very often do, is, you're a podcaster, you do a lot of radio stuff, audio, working in this medium, and yes, you do many things, but I'm curious about that.
I do many things, not all of them well, but I do them. But no, I appreciate that, and this book would not exist without Teddy. So thank you, Teddy. And yeah, give it up. Yeah, and Teddy saw, like the messy side of that, my frantic, manic side of like, oh, this book's not gonna work, like, because I was a bit ambivalent when you approached me about possibly doing this book. Because I've become so partial to the medium of audio, and to a lesser extent video, right? But like I feel like audio is the most intimate medium where you can have the kind of conversations that I want to. Like again, going back to the very first podcast episode I ever recorded with my dad, Jesus, where he opened up to me more on that conversation than he had for all the years that I had known him. And I was like, what was it about thinking that someone else was going to listen to this? What was it about talking over the phone that just allowed him to do that? And I feel like I've experienced so many moments that have stayed with me. Like I remember what my room looked like and where I was sitting when Sherry Renfro told me the line that I just told you guys. Because there was even a point where she cried during that recording because she was talking about how she has no time. Her parents are aging. She just missed another birthday and she's crying. She's like, I don't know how many I have left, right? And then I started crying, right? I mean, like, but there's something where you feel very close to someone where you can just focus on that audio connection. I was worried that that wouldn't translate to text. The tone of it, you know, the sort of jazzy nature of going where your partner in dialogue leads. And also, you know, I knew that, you know, being in text form, right, there's a kind of finality about it that made me very anxious. And so I wanted to be very, very mindful about making this a collaborative storytelling process, right? So, you know, in many ways, I recorded these interviews like I record the ones for the podcast. I didn't come in with a plan because I want to go where this person leads. I want to learn more about their lives as, you know, based on what they're willing to share with me. The one main question I knew, the two things I knew I wanted to do with each interview was like learn more about each person so that readers would see everyone in this book as more than just a name tag or a job title, but a flesh and blood human being with, you know, a complex backstory and who's person who's loved and lost, right? A person with their own nuanced ways of thinking and feeling. And then I wanted to ask everyone kind of a version of the same question, which was like, talk to me about what it was like for you as the reality of COVID-19 really set in. But from there, you know, I wanted to make sure that every interviewee, you know, felt a sense of authorship over, I mean, it's their story, right? So I didn't want to extract things from them. I wanted them to have the final say on the text. I thought of like the recordings, and this is why I guess people have asked about this, like, are we going to release the audio versions? I might. It will really depend on the interviewees because unlike the podcast, I recorded these conversations, like the recordings were the first draft, right? Because then the arduous process of transcribing them, making them readable, because spoken word doesn't translate very well. I became very self-conscious based on how much I say the word like, going over all these transcripts. So you got to eliminate all of that. You want to make it readable, but at the same time, be as faithful as possible to the original conversation, everyone's speech patterns, give, you know, the interviewee a chance to kind of look through it, add, delete, stuff like that. So it was definitely more involved than the podcast recordings, but I wanted the soul of the show to really speak through these interviews as conversations between two people, you know, that can meander and that can really sort of allow the humanity of working people to sing off the page. Right? That's my highfalutin, artsy-fartsy answer to your question.
I just want to say, while we're explicitly just talking about the book, I mean, I read the whole thing. It's great. All the interviews have high points, things worth reading. But the first interview with the guy, Nick, who's a gravedigger, is worth the price of purchase. I couldn't believe, I mean, because one thing you do really well, Max, that I value is like, Max, I think like myself, like Louise, I often use, when I'm speaking to workers, I'm often just like, can you walk me through what your job actually is? I mean, I'm a writer. I don't know how to do a lot of manual jobs, especially. I've never been a sheet metal worker. And this guy, the gravedigger, first of all, so he really explains in depth something that societally we don't like to know, what is the actual like muck and dirt of digging a grave. But he also, he has this quote here that has haunted me since I've read it.
Sorry.
Where he says about he's been doing this job for a long time and he's getting older, he's getting wrinkles, he's getting gray. He says, I'm getting slower, getting weaker, no matter how much I try to fight it. I'm digging people's graves. In due time, I'm digging mine too. But if you're going to risk living, you have to risk dying. It just comes with the territory. I mean, this is like one of the most beautiful things I've ever read and extremely disturbing, the way to think through it. So I while we're plugging the book, it's literature as well as interviews.
Thank you, Alex. That means a lot to me. I mean, yeah, I can't say enough about any of the folks in this book. And you know, I think Nick again, just really like proves that core principle, right? That I've said this for years since doing the show, and I think my answer to how I see what is discussed in this book, how it connects to the labor organizing, the increased militancy, however tenuous and fleeting it may be. Like my understanding of that is hearing folks like really kind of grapple with their own mortality, right? I mean, COVID forced us all to confront the fact that we're all going to die someday in a way that I think normal life before COVID didn't, right? It didn't force us to ask that question as much unless, a family member died or something like that, but then you kind of move on. But when so much death is happening all around you and so much risk is being taken just by stepping out your front door, you inevitably have to start asking yourself, big important questions like, am I doing what I want to be doing? If I died tomorrow, would I be proud of the life that I lived, right? Do I feel, if I may die soon, like, am I doing enough to leave my family in a position that like they won't suffer, right? I think that existential component of COVID-19 cannot be discounted in, like understanding, where a lot of this desire to quit a job for a better one, right? Or demand better pay, right? Or, to say, you know what, like I like my job, but we're getting treated like shit, so we're gonna do something about it. I don't think that's the end all be all, but I do think it's a really important, less acknowledged part of where we are.
I just want to add to that by saying I think that's totally right. That when earlier I was saying people felt like they had nothing left to lose. Part of this was a sense of I only have one life, and I'm forced to kind of confront that. And I always think, I wrote a lot about IATSE, which almost struck would have been this massive, over 100,000 workers nationwide strike, shutting down the film and TV industry. They very narrowly did not strike, but very early on in that process, I talked to this relatively young video like camera guy. These are kind of the manual jobs on a film or TV set are all IATSE members. And he said to me, I guess he was maybe around 30, and he was like, I love this job. It's what I always wanted to do, but I'm quitting. I'm trying to find work outside of the industry, and I'm willing to try to take this last stand with the strike vote, but I think I'm pretty much set. And I was like, well, why is that exactly? And he was talking about how a previous relationship had ended because his hours were totally unpredictable. I mean, film and TV industry people work like 16-hour days. That's not unusual for them. They might weeks on end be unavailable. And he just said to me something that I found really, sort of moving and upsetting, where he just said, when am I going to find time to fall in love? And I was like, look, if that's the question, then like, good luck. Like you should leave this industry if that's how you're feeling. If it doesn't give you the time for living, then what's there to lose? Just you have to change it. And I think that kind of like very existential questions like that, or things people said this to me throughout the pandemic, things like that. People were thinking on a very sort of deep, serious level about what is the point, what am I doing, and what should I do to change it.
Well, and like just to, I guess, pick up on that and connect it to Luis's point. This is also a question that we get asked a lot, right? There's a weird sort of, I get why people do it, right? I mean, we are reporting on stories and trying to give readers and listeners and viewers access to working people that may not be in their immediate sphere, right? We're trying, as that's what media means, right? Be in the middle, to be the connector between things that are disconnected, right? So we are trying to connect different struggles, different human beings in different spaces and times and so on and so forth. So people will inevitably ask us to kind of synthesize, right? Or they'll ask us to speak for, this or that union, right? Or this or that class of workers. And I imagine we all do the same thing, which is like we give a million caveats before we actually give an answer. But I think that where I'm going with this is that Luis is absolutely right that whatever gains have been made over the past 2.5 years that have been made in very like horrendous circumstances, those can be wiped away very easily. I mean, Jesus, inflation already outpaced any average wage growth, in the past year, right? And union density is still in the shitter, right? There's still, and on top of that, the very potentially paradigm shifting ways that the government actually cared for people more than it did, a hell of a lot more than it did during the financial crash, right? Where the entire establishment threw its weight around the big banks and bailing out big corporations, while families like mine and everyone else were left to fall into the abyss, right? So there was something very paradigm shifting in directly putting money into people's pockets through the stimulus checks, the child care tax credits, the extended unemployment benefits, the eviction moratorium, the pause on student debts. That had a huge impact on people because it took away that coercive force, even just a little bit that you're talking about, right? Either what do the women say? We die from COVID or we die from hunger, right? What the ruling class, that is the position the ruling class has always wanted to keep working people in. And for a brief second, and this comes through in a lot of the interviews. In fact, some of the workers that I talked to feel guilty saying this. They're like, I feel bad saying this because so much pain and death is happening all around me, but this was the first time I had a chance to breathe. This is the first time I actually could stay home with my family because of the extended unemployment benefits. And that started to get me to think more about what I was doing with my life. So, sorry, meandering, but the point that I'm getting to is that to deal with the kind of division and fear and anxiety that is inevitably going to come with this top-down pressure that we are already starting to feel, people always ask us, this is where I was going with it, people will always ask us is the working class finally unifying? Are people finally waking up, right? Are people getting past the culture war stuff that divides them? And I always try to tell people, that the answer to that question depends as much on you as it does on me, as much as it does on any of the workers we talk to, right? Because this is work that needs doing across the board. You can, I think, build those bonds of solidarity. You can break, those barriers that divide us by connecting with your fellow workers on these more human existential levels. But that takes work, it takes time, it takes commitment, it takes being there and listening, right? And that's not something any one person can do, any one journalist can do, any one organizer can do. It takes a real culture shift from all of us. And I think that, if there's anything that I hope people are inspired to do by reading this book, it's to just turn to their left and turn to their right and give one another that gift of listening to each other and seeing each other in those human terms.
That seems like a very perfect way to end. I feel like we should ask if there's any more pressing questions, but I think that's, yeah.
Just to give you guys a final question here, because I think you're totally right about the gains being wiped away, and that's already being done on multiple levels. But from my experience, I've never seen anything like this. And I come from very poor miners and working people and all this in Kentucky, and I've worked since I was very young, and I've been a Teamster and a wobbly and all the rest. What I noticed is, as poor kids, you're treated as trash. You're throwaway immediately. And you see, a 13-year-old lose his foot in a bush hog, or you see a guy get his fingers cut off in a pendulum saw. You see all this as a teenager. So you know that nobody gives a damn about you. And just like a dog that's been beaten, most of them cower. Some of them become beasts. And so some of us would burn, we burned some owners' houses down. We beat guys up on like subcontractors. We do things like this because we were enraged. And you could call it political consciousness, but it's the precondition for political consciousness. Now what I'm seeing is people are so enraged at what they've been shown that wiping the gains away is not necessarily that important. I now here in New York, I live off paintings and tattooing and things, but my money doesn't just go to me, so sometimes I need a little balance. And I took a job as a trucker briefly, and the guy who owned the truck, one truck, Is just a criminal, old man who rips people off. I purposely screwed his paperwork up. I called him and I egged him on to give him a heart attack. Uh, and a buddy asked me to do some carpentry for another guy, and I had to tell him, I said, I may be too far gone. Like I'm so angry. I took a job as a carpenter for a couple months this winter, just to make sure work was balanced. And everyone there, they were younger than me. They were enraged, talking about World War III, talking about going to Wall Street and gunning people down. And the owner, who was actually very nice, he grew up in the Soviet Union. I went to his office, and he was talking about insurance and these matters that are now being pulled. And he said something about the Bolsheviki. And I said, well, the one big complaint I have about them is you gun down all the wealth. I said, don't let anybody get out. And he put his thumb up, the owner of the company. He said, you understand history. Well, I've never been able to talk like this en masse. You always have a couple of guys at a construction site that are angry, that won't take shit off people. But now the whole culture is this way. And I've got friends still in West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, as well as Hong Kong and New York City and Paris. And unless you are part of that group that got to work at home, sit at your computer, order your DoorDash, and not worry about this, people were enraged. And Max and I were talking about this. The Trump voters, I hate this term because although you have a few racists, rapists, all the rest, and usually in office, the majority of people don't know anything about politics. They just know they're hungry, they're upset, and they want to get their hands around the throats of a senator or something. All very understandable. And if they have a piece of garbage like Trump, maybe they'll vote for him. But they have to vote according to their setup, so they have to vote for someone. They're not necessarily anything other than enraged. And I do realize the gains, as you said, they're going to be taken down. They are being taken down. But the rage is very different. And that's not political consciousness, but it is a precondition. A friend of mine, just last thing I'll add to this, she's a writer, and they're having a union drive. They're being crushed at a couple of different magazines in town. They have a business union that is coming in, and is tamping down their anger and telling them, you're doing all this wrong. Here's the model for organizing, and wrecking everything they're doing. I don't see that you're going to have that behavior from business unions tolerated for very long. You're seeing it with Starbucks and Amazon. Like something's going on. This is what I'm seeing, and this is what I'm passing to you guys. So, did I take somebody's mic? Oh.
No, I mean, I think that's well put, man. And just like something that actually both Alex and Luis wrote versions of this in pieces that I read of theirs from 2020, right, was that the anxious opening that COVID provided, right? There was this kind of sense that it could go many different ways, but the horizon was itself opening, right? And that can be a very terrifying thing to confront because we are not the only ones vying for the future, right? And in many ways, we're outgunned and outmatched, but we are not outnumbered. And I think that, just to kind of reiterate what I said before, right, that it's really going to take all of us, and it's going to take all of us fighting on many, many fronts wherever we are, however we can, to have that tipping effect. Because what I see right now is the same merchants of oppression and exploitation and division using their power to channel that rage everywhere but the top, right? I mean, we can all live in our little algorithmically sorted echo chambers, but the far right, which is increasingly more of what we call the right in this country, is frothing at the mouth over LGBTQ people, teachers, right? Librarians, right? This is what the right does, is they take that very legitimate anger and they direct it sideways, right? Or they only very selectively take lambs for the slaughter from the echelons of the owning class, right? They outcast singular politicians like Liz Cheney, right? Or singular business people, but they do not indict an entire class, unless it can be racialized, unless it could be, you know, turned into some sort of a conspiratorial segment, like the Jews, right, or immigrants, right, or again, gender ideology, whatever the fuck, right? So like that's what we're up against. And they also have a big fucking megaphone, and they have a lot of people on Capitol Hill and across the country who will repeat that same message and recycle that same toxic air through the vents of our culture. So it's going to be a dogfight, I think, is where we should end up with this. It's going to be a dogfight, and it's going to take all of us. Thank you for coming.